Hello again. You've made it to Pre-ED's training module number 5, where we'll be focusing on work experiences. Once again, this is Alyssa Klein, VRS Transition and Pre-Employment Transition Specialist, and with me is
Ann Macklin, VRS Training and Development Specialist, and also we have
Sarah Sundin, Rehabilitation Program Specialist on the Community Partnerships team.
Here is the agenda for this training module. First, we'll have an overview of work experiences. Then we'll review work experience intermediate job search. We'll talk a little bit about work experience follow-up versus work-based learning coaching services. And finally, we'll be giving you some examples. So let's review how VRS and community partners can support work experiences for students with disabilities. As was reviewed in training module number 2, the Pre-ED's work-based learning service type has 3 service titles. The first title is Introductory Work Activities, and that includes career mentorship, informational interviews, job shadowing, service learning, or workplace tour or field trip. The other 2 service titles are the 2 that we are going to focus on in this module, which is work experience services and work experience wages. So this is also a review. So these again are the 3 ways that VRS can authorize for work experience services. Number 1 is if the student needs help in finding an intermediate job, where an employer will pay the student's wages. This is the typical job placement process. You may recall that we call this work experience an intermediate job because it is a stepping stone along the student's career path. VRS can authorize up to 30 hours for community partners to help the student with their job search, to orient them to the experience, and then follow up with them and the employer once they have the job. Number 2 is when the student is interested in a short-term work experience and the site still needs to be developed. This is when your agency will be paying the student a wage, which is also funded by VRS through work experience wages, and we're going to cover that next. VRS can authorize up to 20 hours for a community partner to develop the site, orient the student to that site, and then follow up with the student and the employer during the experience. Number 3 is when a student is interested in a short-term work experience, but the site is already developed. Again, your agency would be paying the student their wages, which would be funded under work experience wages, and VRS can authorize up to 10 hours for orienting the student to this set site and then following up with the student and the employer. Also, as review, these are all of the activities that may take place within work experience services. Number 1 would be the first meeting, or if it's a student who's eligible for VR, it would be an intake. Number 2 is the time it takes to develop and or locate the work experience. Number 3 is orienting the student to the work experience. So everything that's included here, like helping them to understand who their supervisor is, understand their schedule, make sure they understand how they're going to get to and from the work experience, etc. And then number 4 is to follow up or check in with the student and the employer. As is indicated here, the follow-up frequency can be determined based on that student's need, and it would be discussed with the whole team, the student, the VRS staff, and you as the provider. And just as with all other Pre-ED services, these items can also be included within work experience services too. And we reviewed these in module number 4. So again, the service time, the preparation time, employer development time, any team meetings, and the travel time. Note that VRS staff must receive approval from their manager or RAM if you would be going beyond the 30, 20, or 10-hour maximum amounts indicated for each type of work experience service. There is no set length of time for short-term work experiences. However, when you aren't sure, 120 hours is a really good benchmark that is used by other programs. Keep in mind that you can go beyond this time, but that a short-term work experience isn't meant to go on indefinitely. If a student wants a long-term work experience, then it might be time for the VRS staff person to authorize for you to help that student in obtaining an intermediate job where the employer would be paying their wage. Lastly, there's no manager approval necessary for a counselor or PREATS representative to authorize for a work experience to go beyond the 120 hours. Because the authorizing process for work experiences is a bit confusing, we created a desk aid that walks VRS and community partners staff through that process. So the first document linked on the slide here is a flowchart version. And then the second document is an accessible Word version of that flowchart. So I'd recommend that you pull up one or both of these documents, and it will really help you when you have a student and you can see how the authorizing process will go, whether it's a short-term work experience or that intermediate job. Now I'm going to hand it over to Anne.
Thanks, Alyssa. There are particular steps that we ask our community partners to follow for the intermediate job search, which also follows our job placement process for those of you who have been through performance-based agreements or have PBAs on your contracts. This visual compares work experiences to final jobs. For purposes of this presentation, a final job is when VRS is supporting an individual with a career-related position, something more permanent that we intend to close that VRS case file after the person attains that job. So to be clear, when a student is in school and needs help looking for a work experience, we authorize for work experience services. If a person is looking for the final job, then we authorize the PBA. Also note, some students may start a final job search in their final months of high school because they aren't going on to post-secondary education. So there can be times that VRS will authorize a PBA when a person is still in high school. If your agency provides placement services through a PBA, there is a particular reporting process that you are asked to follow. This slide emphasizes that the only document from the PBA placement process that we ask you to use for work experiences for intermediate jobs is that VRS placement plan. The other forms are not necessary. Instead, you would just send the typical invoicing report. We do expect that typical pre-job search activities are followed when a student is going into an intermediate job search. The VRS counselor or the PREATS representative should review and discuss these following things: the placement team approach, informed choice, interest and goals of the students, employment-related skills and abilities, the labor market information, criminal background, and credit report and credit history as they relate to the job goal. And we know that that may not impact a lot of younger students as much, but it is important to have in there. So the first step in the process for referring students to a community partner for any work experience is the following. For students eligible for VR, the invitation to placement team form will be submitted to the community partner by the VRS counselor, along with the VRS referral form. For potentially eligible students, page 3 of the PREATS referral form is submitted by the PREATS representative, along with those pages you typically do, that 1 and 2 page. The same pertinent information that is in the invitation to placement form is on that page 3. So it's probably something that's very familiar to you all. The second step with all students that are looking for intermediate jobs is for our community partners to complete the placement plan with the student and the VRS staff. The placement plan would be completed at the first meeting together or the intake meeting for students that are eligible for VR. The placement plan is linked for you here on this PowerPoint. So if you were to access that PowerPoint, you can get access to that plan. The placement plan actually lists possible goals and responsibilities of the job seeker. In this case, the student. It lists also the responsibilities for the placement professional and the VRS counselor or the pre-ETS rep. Note that not all roles and responsibilities need to be checked, only the ones that are pertinent to this particular situation and the student. The placement plan should be signed by all 3 core team members, and then all parties should get a signed copy of that plan. Here on the slide are other important things that should be reviewed at that first meeting together for any person that is entering a job search. And some of these might be pretty common for many of you. So it should be transportation, the housing situation, care arrangements, medical insurance, cultural or religious considerations, disability disclosure, support systems that are available to the student, and then verify employment authorization documents like an I-9, those things that you need to verify and are important to that discussion. Also, during the entire placement process, the team should always be considering these items on this slide in case they become relevant to the student in being successful in their intermediate job. Things like disability disclosure, whether you should disclose, what kind of accommodations, independent living services, and whether those are needed, benefits and how somebody's benefits might be impacting work, work-based learning coaching as well to know whether that person's going to need significant coaching on the job or at what frequency, and what accommodations, what reasonable accommodations could work for that student. In addition, these are all items that are included in that intermediate job search process. So we're saying here, job placement services include, but are not limited to, starting with identifying and developing job opportunities, assisting the individual with creating and updating resumes, completing the job application and pre-employment tests, preparing for those job interviews, completing cover letters and thank you letters, making sure the job is a good match, and assisting employers to identify and eliminate barriers. And now I'll hand it off to Sarah.
All right, once a student gets either a short-term work experience or an intermediate job, follow-up is crucial to ensure that it's going well. Some students may need more comprehensive supports through coaching services. And since there have been questions about the difference between these 2 distinct processes, we will look at the definitions next. Again, follow-up should be provided to all students with any type of work experience. Follow-up includes contact with the student and/or the employer to determine ongoing satisfaction with the work experience and assist with problem solving if issues arise. Whereas work-based learning coaching is a more intensive service. It involved training along with the consultation with the student and the business to make sure that the work experience goes well for the student. Here are more specific details related to follow-up. Follow-up is authorized as work experience services at $75 an hour. Follow-up can be provided to both eligible and potentially eligible students. And there is no prescribed amount of time for the follow-up services. It should be agreed upon by you, the student, and the VRS staff. Follow-up can be provided on or off the job site using whichever mode of communication works best for the student and/or the employer. For example, email, text, telephone, or face-to-face. Remember this slide from Module 1? Pre-ETS is not about assessment. Pre-ETS is student-driven, informal, and only the student or the employer report on how the work experience is going. Whereas general services, an assessment can rely on third-party or VRS staff-driven information. Assessments are formal, and there is an evaluation report. So when you write your reports, you should be objective, not evaluative, and only include the student and employer feedback on how the experience went. The work experience follow-up report template that is linked here can be used to help you structure your reporting of the work experience. Now let's review the work-based learning coaching more carefully. This is authorized as Pre-ETS work-based learning coaching at $75 an hour. Only students who are eligible for VR services can receive these services. Work-based learning coaching is essentially the same thing as job coaching services. It can help the student learn transportation, train on the skills they need to learn in order to perform their work duties, and help them with learning new duties. Furthermore, work-based learning coaching can include training and assistance with work behaviors and interpersonal skills, training to develop an understanding of employment practices and business policies, assistance in changes in the work environment impacting the potential for work experience retention, identifying, utilizing, and integrating natural supports in the workplace, and exploring and seeking a permanent job offer or advancement within the work experience. Finally, keep in mind that work-based learning coaching can only be provided when a student is in a short-term work experience or intermediate job. So if a student gets a final job, but is still in high school, job coaching would be authorized versus the work-based learning coaching. This service would be the same, but the service on the authorization, report, and invoice is just titled differently. And now I will hand it back to Alyssa.
All right. So let's review a couple of examples that show how authorizing would work for each of the three types of work experience services. The first example is Stephen, who is a senior in high school who has never had a job. He needs assistance to get a pre-ETS work experience or intermediate job where the employer will pay his wages, doing stocking at a retail store. Here is how Stephen's authorizing would work. First of all, there'd be 1 to 2 hours authorized for a first meeting under work experience services, or a pre-ETS intake would be authorized if he's eligible for VR. Then up to 30 hours can be authorized at $75 an hour under work experience services, which can include time for the job search assistance, orienting the student to the job, and follow-up. And it can also include preparation time, employer development, team meetings, and travel. Next is Sadie, who is a junior in high school. She has a long-term goal of becoming an auto mechanic, and she would like to have a short-term work experience where the provider pays the wages at an auto shop over the summer to see what that working environment is like. So here is how Sadie's authorizing would work. Again, there's the 1 to 2 hours for a first meeting or the pre-ETS intake, and then up to 20 hours at $75 an hour under work experience services, which can include time for developing a short-term site, orienting her to the experience, and then follow-up. And again, preparation, employer development, team meetings, or travel can also be included. And because Sadie is participating in a short-term work experience, VRS also needs to authorize for work experience wages. The wage is figured by looking at other entry-level employees at the place of business, or in cases where they don't typically hire for this type of job, by looking at the entry-level wage at other similar businesses in the area. In this case, it was figured that the wage would be $11 an hour. Thus, VRS authorizes for that wage plus 50% for administrative costs to your organization. So in this case, that would be $5.50 for a total of $16.50 an hour. Sadie will work 80 hours, so $16.50 times 80 equals $1,320. The last example is Hua, who is a 10th grader that dreams of becoming a chef. The community partner has a relationship with a nearby restaurant that will allow students to try out jobs that they have. Hua will participate in a 120-hour experience where she will do prep work in the kitchen. So here is how authorizing will look for Hua. Again, there's the 1 to 2 hours for a first meeting or the pre-ETS intake, and then up to 10 hours at $75 an hour with the title of work experience services, which can include time for orienting her to the experience and the following up. And again, preparation, team meetings, employer development, as well as travel, which got cut off on this slide, I realize, can all be included in those 10 hours. Lastly, the VRS staff will need to authorize for work experience wages at $10 an hour, which is the entry-level pay at that restaurant, plus 50% admin costs to your organization, which in this case would be $5, which would equal $15 an hour times 120 hours equals $1,800. You can see sample reports and invoices within the Resources tab on the Community Partner Pre-ETS page on the DEED VRS website. Amaya Jackson is an example of a student who is looking for an intermediate job, and we have the sample report and sample invoice for Amaya Jackson linked on this slide. Scarlett Pine is an example of a student who will have a short-term work experience. So again, we have a sample report and a sample invoice linked on this page, as well as linked on our DEED website. So that concludes the Pre-ETS training module number 5 for our community partners. Again, please feel free to contact any of us with any questions that you have. And thank you for viewing these training modules. We appreciate that you are partnering with VRS to provide pre-employment transition services.